And without further ado, over to you.
Cool. Well, let me see if I can get share screen happening. Okay, that's okay. So can you see the screen?
We can. Perfect.
Lovely. So yeah, thank you for that. I think the underlying theme to all of this is this word we keep hearing, which is complexity, and recognition that the world is getting more complex. And as that conversation around complexity kind of evolves, so too we hear now about the need to think systemically. The issue, there we go. The issue with that is, as Claire said, what does that mean? Because there's actually lots of different ways of thinking systemically. In the coaching supervision space, those of you familiar with it, you may be familiar with this, the 7-I model. When coaching supervisors tend to talk about a systemic approach, this is the model they tend to go to. And what you can see is it encourages the coach supervisor to think about not just the coach's issue with the client, but the supervisor's relationship with the coach, the wider context, the supervisory relationship, etc. So it's essential. And then the new version of this model then splits out the wider context into different categories. So what the model's doing, and you may have seen this in the coaching space too, is it's encouraging us to look wider. Here's an old quote: look wide, and even when you think you're looking wide, look wider still. And that's kind of what seems to be meant by systemic. Certainly when I ask other coaches sometimes, what do you mean by systemic? Or leaders, because leaders are getting asked to think more systemically, that tends to be the response. We need to take a step back, take a balcony view, look wider. However, the question we're going to talk about today is, once you've taken that view and you're looking wider, how are you interpreting what you're seeing? Through what lens are you looking at the broader picture? That lens is a metaphor for how you think. And today we're going to talk about different ways of thinking about systems. And I'm going to ask you as we go through this, just to challenge yourself, which of these ways of thinking feel familiar and which of these ways of thinking perhaps don't feel familiar. If you look at change theory, one of the kind of premises of change theory is that how we think influences how others think. So and most of us work with leaders as coaches, some of us may be leaders, but if I'm sitting here as a coach, or I'm sitting here as a coach supervisor, then it's interesting just to remind yourself that everything you say in a coaching conversation influences how the other person thinks. So how leaders think, those that work with coaches, it's very much impacted by how you think. And so I find that quite a sobering thought, because it says to me, whoa, do I actually have some responsibility even for challenging the way that I think? So in this systemic space, how do you think when coaching, supervising, or leading? And I'm going to describe 5 different ways of thinking about systems, and they're all systemic. The question here is not, am I systemic? Because anybody who takes a step back and takes a broad perspective is being systemic in the broadest sense. But it's in what ways of thinking systemically do we have access to? The first way, and I'm going to go through these in more detail, but just to give you an introduction, is this linear way of thinking about systems. So I'm stepping back, but my lens, the lens I'm looking at, the way I'm thinking is, well, if I pull this lever, then this will happen. If my If a leader who wants to influence people talks more compellingly, then people will be more engaged. If I pull this lever, that will happen. That's the linear systemic way of thinking. The non-linear systemic way of thinking, which again I'll talk about in more detail, says, yeah, kinda, but you've got to look at it. You've got to look at it in a bit more depth than that. It's a bit more complicated than that. It's not quite as simple as pull a lever and such happens. The collaborative systemic way of thinking says, actually, when you're thinking about complexity, what's happening out there is too complicated for any one person to really understand. It's too complex. All the parts are moving very quickly. What's happening today isn't the same as what's happening tomorrow. What we need to do is be humble and recognize the limitations of our own subjective perspective. And we need to really genuinely, authentically wonder what other people are, how other people are experiencing what's going on. We need to have respect for other people's perspectives. And it says the best way to approach a complex problem is to get a few different perspectives in the room and together form a hypothesis as to what's going on, and then go and do some stuff and see if our hypothesis might be right. The complex systemic way of looking at things is quite radically different. And it says, hey, leaders, you don't get to control outcomes. You can't control change. That's not the way change works. Actually, the way change works is you have, change is constant, and any group of people at any one point in time is making sense of what's going on in their own way. And then you've got another group of people here who are making sense of change in their own way, and it might be different. And you've got another group of people over there who are making sense of change in their own way. And so if you as the leadership team say, hey, this is what's going on, this is what we need to do, don't expect people to necessarily obey you or to comply. What you can expect is that they will make sense together of what you're saying, come up with their own conclusions, and then the conclusions from all of these different conversations will merge, and out will come something unpredictable. That's how we look at change, through a complex systemic lens. And that's quite scary, because it says, as leader, I don't get to control things. What I can do and do, whether I like it or not, is influence things. So I'm going to expand on that later, but it's a very different way of looking about systems. And then the meta-systemic perspective, back to Baden-Powell again, says, okay, this is all very interesting. All of these perspectives are useful. We're not saying the further you go, you trash all the others. They're all useful in different contexts. But by the way, organizations are not systems. Organizations, you cannot compare, you cannot say that an organization is exactly like a hot water system or an aircraft engine or a living system. There are some similarities, and those may be useful comparisons, but human beings are not like the components of a machine. Human beings are willful. Human beings make their own mind up about stuff. Human beings are not like the cogs of a big wheel. And so we need to be very cautious about comparing organizations to systems, and thinking about teams as real entities and organizations as real entities. And I'll expand on that one too. So here's 5 ways of thinking about systems, which I'm going to explain in more detail. As I do it, what I'd ask you to do is imagine you've got 100 jelly beans, and think about, as we go, how many of your jelly beans you're going to allocate to each way of thinking. How much time do you think, as coach or as supervisor or as leader, how much time, as I describe these in more detail, do you think you spend in each of these 5 spaces and the way that you think? The premise here is not, hey, let's all think metasystemically. The premise here is all of these ways of thinking can be useful. The more ways of thinking we have access to, then the more adaptable, agile, and effective we will be in our work. So as a kind of self-exercise, no, I ask you to share it. just have a think as we go through this. Where do you tend to gravitate towards? Okay. So I'll go through each of these 5 ways of thinking, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation. So here's the linear one. I'm going to explain this in more detail. So the change philosophy here is I can control change. I'm a leader. I can control change. It's good to compare an organization to a system, and I can step out that system, view it as a neutral observer, diagnose what's going on, work out what to do, and then go make it happen. I very much believe in my positional authority. People do as they're asked to do, basically, as long as it's well reasoned and logical, unless they're resistant to change. And that's the philosophy. Now let me try and explain. And so it's very much like a hot water system. It's comparing the organization to a hot water system. A plus B equals C. A hot water system is basically a linear system. The water's boiling away, so click the switch off and the water cools down. Water gets too cold, click the switch on, water gets hot again. Nothing wrong with this way of thinking, remember, I'm not trashing it. And in many instances, this would be a useful, quick way of thinking about what's happening. COVID. We heard a lot of linear systemic thinking when COVID started. Quote from a world leader, "We've got it totally under control. Just one person coming in from China, we've got it under control." Notice this word control. It's going to be fine. We've got 10 cases today. If we do nothing in 10 days, we'll have 100 cases. So we've got plenty of levers to pull. We can close borders, isolate ourselves, wear masks, not worried. I said this is a linear systemic way of thinking. Got 10 cases today, we'll have 100 in 10 days if we do nothing. Let's think about a real coaching assignment. So Marie is a leader. She's finding work stressful. She wants to work no more than 9 hours a day so she can spend time with her kids. Instead, she's working into the evening and this is a real life example, by the way. She's working into the evening and at weekends. She leads a team in which people are shared across teams. She needs to be able to delegate, but too many people lack the skills to get work done to the standards required. She spends a lot of time reworking other people's work. She's getting stressed. And so Hero is her coach, and he helps her with time management and relationships. He helps her better prioritize her work and plan better. They've worked on her reluctance to hold her staff to account and to push back. And they both believe that if Marie gets better at planning and engaging in difficult conversations, pull the lever, she'll have a better work-life balance. And sometimes that works. But in this case, for whatever reason, Marie's not following up on her actions. Hero goes to her supervisor, and they explore what might be getting in the way of preventing Marie from taking the actions that will resolve her issue, from pulling the right levers. So you can see at the moment, we're very much in that linear systemic space. If something's wrong, I just need to find the right lever to pull. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't work, we might say, oh, well, Marie's not following up on her actions, she's not committed to coaching, or whatever rationalization we want to use. But let's think now through the non-linear systemic lens. If this is the way I think, I can still control change. I can still step outside the organization, see what's going on, come up with a way forward, but I'm going to need to be smart here. I'm going to need to be smart because it's not as simple as pull a lever and this happens. It can all be a bit more complicated and complex than that. Maybe the world's a bit more like an aircraft engine than a hot water system. And I really need to dig deep to find out what's going on. I've got to be clever. And by the way, as I said, did a lot of research, looked at systems theories and put them into 5 different buckets. When you go and read the literature, people will talk sometimes with great authority about this is systems thinking. And the way of this non-linear systemic way of thinking that I'm talking about is probably the most akin to the Peter Senge work on systems thinking, where they define systems thinking really very much in terms of this non-linear systemic. As I said, it's useful sometimes, but it's not the only way of thinking about systems. COVID. Now, this was a quote from a PhD associate professor in Washington, a bit further on into COVID, who said, oh, yeah, it's a bit more complicated than just wearing masks and stuff. Contact tracing is complicated, low availability of testing. How do you even know how many people are infected when we don't get to test people? It's transmitted very quick. Sometimes people have got the disease when it looks like they don't have the disease. How do you go and vaccinate everybody when all the people who do the vaccination get infected? So you can see he's looking at this and going, hey, it's a little bit more complicated than just wearing masks and shutting borders and isolating. Now, our way of thinking about change here also is not linear, it's non-linear. So I'm much more worried than the person in the first who thinks linear systemically, because I'm thinking, wow, what we're finding out here is one person typically infects 2, 3, or 4 people. If we've got 10 cases today, we might have 10,000 cases in 10 days if we do nothing. So my perspective on change and the way I think is that bit smarter and that bit more complicated. What's the barrier to this way of thinking? In other words, why do people tend to think linear systemically and not non-linear systemically? The answer tends to be time. And I don't know what your experience is, or one of the barriers is time. This demands us to really sit down and have a good think about what's going on. And many of us and many of the people we work with are just really busy these days. So they'll tend to make the quick decision, which tends to be based on simple linear systemic thinking. So here you go. Marie tried prioritizing. It doesn't seem to matter how she decides to spend her time. The work just keeps coming. She built a weekly planning rota on a spreadsheet and usually starts the week well, but by Tuesday, she's not planning the day properly and is just firefighting. Some weeks when Hero talks to Marie, she seems to have got things under control. Other weeks, she seems to be completely overwhelmed. What's going on here? It's not simple. Judy asks questions of Hero, and he comes up with a hypothesis based on what he's heard. When Marie's on top of things, this is his hypothesis. He's thought about this more deeply. When she's on top of things, she finishes the day having completed all her tasks. But when she finishes the day with 1 or 2 tasks outstanding, her line manager gets anxious, sends her emails and to the team. Responding to those emails takes up too much time, and the work suddenly starts backing up. And it doesn't back up linearly, it starts going exponential. So now Hero and Judy have started thinking about this issue in a little bit more depth. Their analysis is a bit more probing. They're not thinking so linearly. And this may help them find another way of thinking, or it may not. Collaborative systemic, there's a frog there because this way of thinking started with Gregory Bateson, who was, this is quite a long time ago, but he was an anthropologist, and he was just had this amazing eureka moment when he heard about this research that this zoologist had done with frogs. And this zoologist found out that frogs only see things that move. They don't see things that don't move. So as a frog is just sitting there and a fly buzzes, tongue comes out, eats the fly, and the frog's happy. But if there's a fly just lying there on the floor, frog doesn't see it. Doesn't just not see it. From the frog's perspective, that fly doesn't exist. If the frog can't see it, as far as the frog's concerned, it doesn't exist. And Bateson was really excited by that because he said, that's what we're like. That's what we're like. We see things, we see certain things, and some things we don't see. But what we see That's what we call reality. But the way that we see and the way that we look actually is very proactive. We create what we see. And we all create what we see in different ways. And he thought, that's really interesting. It means we can't rely on our own judgment and our own perception to be real. We cannot see reality. So what we need to do if we're going to manage change is we need to this is where the humility comes in. We need to recognize the limitations of our own perceptions. So if we want to address complex change, we need to get some people in the room, and we need to really be humble and listen to each other to construct between us a hypothesis as to what might be going on. So we need to collaborate. And if a leader thinks this way, you'll know, because that leader, you'll just sense it, will be absolutely committed to collaboration and finding out what's going on. Won't be a token effort. They'll be absolutely committed to it. This philosophy, though, still says we can control change. It's just we, not I anymore. So the 3 or 4 of us, let's say the leadership team, we're a nice diverse team. We can step outside the system, diagnose, work out what's going on, and manage change. But we need to be collaborative about it. My father-in-law was in hospital recently for quite a long time, and he got quite frustrated, as did the family, because he kept speaking to different doctors, and different doctors would tell him, give him very different stories about what was going on. And they all spoke with great confidence about what was going on, but their stories were different. It wasn't until his illness really got very serious that these doctors actually came together and started comparing notes. And from that collaboration emerged a new insight as to what was actually going on for him. COVID. Now, if I'm COVID-wise, if I was thinking through this lens, and I don't think too many people were, but yeah, we've got 10,000 cases, we might have 10,000. We don't know what to do. You don't hear terribly many politicians saying we're not sure what to do. And by the way, the reason politicians tend not to say we're not sure what to do is we, the voters, in democratic countries anyway, we, the voters, tend not to vote them in because we expect people to be certain. Now, how many governments at the beginning of COVID went, right, first thing we've got to do is talk to Singapore, South Korea, and Canada, because they all had SARS virus. We didn't. They've experienced this before. What did they do? There's a humility attached to this. We can still control it through experimentation, but there's a humility. I'm not sure we saw too many world leaders articulating this, but we did see some business leaders. I was doing some work in a professional services firm, and pretty early on, the exec team, the CEO, did a conversation with the organization, virtual, and said, we're not sure what the best thing is to do. We're not sure, but we're going to have to do something. So here's what we're going to do, and we're going to see how it goes. And that was more, and we'd be interested to know what you think. That was more typical of a collaborative, systemic way of thinking. All right, Marie's still finding work stressful, tries to prioritize and plan. Hero's really good questions have helped her understand why her workload seems to switch and seems to be right up here one day and down here another day. She succeeded in persuading a line manager not to write emails to the team because that creates havoc. Just write them to her if he's getting anxious. But she's still overwhelmed. He still thinks this is about finding a better way to engage with the line manager. Needs to negotiate with the line manager. Hero's still thinking perhaps in this linear, non-linear, systemic way. Has a conversation with his supervisor, and Judy helps Hero explore Mari's situation through the eyes of others. Through the eyes of others. With Marie's permission, Hero actually speaks to Marie's line manager, 6 or 7 other stakeholders, and starts getting some very different perspectives on Murray's issue. And those perspectives are very helpful and create a different scenario. By the way, through this collaborative systemic lens, all of a sudden group supervision rather than individual supervision becomes like, yeah, group supervision is good. My individual supervision is good too, because I've got a good supervisor. Maybe I want to keep doing that, but I do want to do group supervision, because in group supervision, I'm going to get multiple perspectives on the issue that I'm trying to address. And that's the collaborative systemic way of thinking. Complex systemic is, as I said before, fundamentally different. We cannot control change. So let me tell you a little story to illustrate what I mean by complex systemic. And this is, again, this is a real story. Happened just before COVID, when I was doing some coaching skills work in an organization, working with a group of 12 people. And we had a morning tea, morning tea, that's an Australian phrase, I think. We had a break in morning to have a cup of tea and a bun or a cake. And I was just kind of standing there, kind of just reflecting what had been going on so far. But I heard around me conversations, and the group of 12 had kind of split into 3 groups, just because that's the way things go. And they were all talking about this email that everyone in the organization had received that morning. And the email said, we said to you that everybody would be getting a 10% bonus this year. That's what we said. Bad news is we haven't earned enough profit to pay out 10%, so it's only going to be 7%. Okay, that was the big topic of discussion. This group here said that is totally unacceptable. We didn't ask for a promise, but they said 10% bonus no matter what. So that is a lack of integrity, and we're really unhappy about that. In this group over here, there's me listening in, they were saying, good. People in this organization are not commercial enough. Of course, you can't pay out 10% bonuses if you haven't earned the money. This is a step in the right direction towards helping our organization get more commercially aware. And then the third group, I sort of wandered over, said, the conversation that was emerging there said, okay, we're not hitting our targets, but our profit numbers are pretty much in line with last year's numbers. And last year, we all received an 8% bonus. So why are we not getting an 8% bonus? So this is what I mean. You can't control change. The leadership team had explained in great detail why they couldn't pay a 10% bonus. They had all the data, all the information, they'd explained it. And they were kind of expecting everyone to agree. But that's not what was going on. What was happening was different groups were making sense of that message differently. And then, of course, people from those groups would then talk to each other, and who knows what would emerge, but it wouldn't have been, yeah, that's a good idea, we all agree. And the senior leadership team, if they were thinking through a linear systemic lens or even a non-linear systemic lens, would then just go, resistant to change. It's not resistance to change, it's actually reflecting how change really happens all the time. And we, as the leader, as that leadership team found out, cannot control change, but they can influence change. And if they want to influence change, they really need to get out there into those groups and listen, understand what sense is being made, and voice their own view. But if they're going to be really influential, they're going to be open-minded. They're going to be curious, and they're open to the possibility that what they hear may change their view. It's a very different way of thinking about leadership. Yeah, didn't hear too much of this in COVID personally. This would say, okay, it's complex. We need to, we can't control things. Yes, we can, organizations close borders. It didn't stop COVID. Might have slowed it down. But those boundaries aren't real boundaries. We can't control this. So we need to actually get out there and understand what's going on. Interesting thing, because I live in Australia and Bondi Beach is pretty famous. One summer's day during COVID, the beach got packed full of people. There was no social distancing, no masks. Everyone had just had enough of isolation and they went to the beach. And government here got furious. It was in the papers and there was comments about how irresponsible this behavior was. How do we punish them? Now, if I'm thinking through a complex systemic lens, and I know how complex the world is, and I know people are not cogs in a wheel, and I know people don't just do what they're told, I'd be out there on the beach in my hazmat suit. I'd be out there on the beach, talking to people, seeking to understand why, through their lens, it was okay to be on the beach. And through that learning, I would then think about, okay, now what do I do? Now what do I say? Very different way of thinking about change, and a very and this phenomenon, by the way, happened all over the world. It happened in Bondi, and then I found out exactly the same thing happened in the UK. I think it was Bournemouth. Exactly the same thing happened in the US, the Ozarks. And in each and every case, if you go and Google this, you'll see the response from the local lawmakers was irresponsible. How do we punish them? I didn't hear any curiosity about what's going on here. However, here's an example where I did hear some curiosity, which is brilliant. And this is, I was talking to a friend who was on the board of a dance company in Canada. And all of the people in the dance company have been told to isolate. And then one of them had a birthday. And everyone from the dance company, all the dancers went to the birthday party, not supposed to. And a lot of them got COVID and they had to close the dance school. And when the board met, they were a bit frustrated, of course they were, but they were also curious and understanding. And one of the conversations was, yeah, this is a good dance school. These people have come from all over Canada and the US. They're young people living on their own. Of course they wanted company. Let's really try and understand what's going on here, because it will help us work out what to do next in the system that's going to be effective. They were thinking through this more complex systemic lens. All right, back to Marie and Hero. So with Hero's encouragement, Marie explores some other approaches, spends more time with a line manager, helps him think through how to push back on requests for more work without necessarily being able to secure resources. They do succeed in getting more resources, but the resources are too junior. If anything, they make things worse. But for example, by making unhelpful changes to document that Marie has to go and fix. So she's kind of done what Hero asked her to do. She's really, really had that conversation with the line manager who's responded, but it's still not fixing the issue. Hero and Marie talk about it. She says she's just too busy to train up new people. And by the way, when she trains up new people, her colleagues just appropriate those people, leaving her back where she started. Hero doesn't know where to go next. Judy and Hero unpack what's going on. Okay, the allocation of resource seems to be out of the control of Marie's line manager. So how does resource allocation work? How might Marie influence more collaborative behavior among her colleagues so that people are more willing to develop the people that they have, that it becomes a joint task? They recognize that there's a general mantra in this organization that says, you just need to do whatever you need to do when the going gets tough. It seems to be the company norm, and it's that company norm that's getting in the way of people collaborating and addressing this issue together. Marie's probably not going to. Now, Hero and Judy see Marie as part of the organization, as part of that social system. And they recognize that Marie's issue isn't going to be simply fixed by pulling a lever. There needs to be some exploration and influencing of the broader social system. They're thinking now through a more complex systemic lens. Last one, meta-systemic. Now, here's the thing. Teams, when you look at some of the complex systemic stuff, it encourages us to think in terms of systems and boundaries. Let's think about the team and the people interacting in the team. Let's think about the organization, another big circle, and the people interacting in the organization. We're thinking through a complex systemic lens. We recognize our need to get out there and influence. And the team, we can draw a nice big boundary around the team. By drawing these boundaries, we're again comparing the organization to a system. The organization is a system with a subsystem and another subsystem. We're thinking systemically to come up with some insights. But organizations are not systems for the reasons I described before. Teams are not real. Teams are not real entities. Yeah. See, if you do any team coaching, one of the things I do, team coaching, is one of the questions I'll ask everyone individually before we start is, who's on the team? You often get quite different answers. Who's on the team? Well, it's us 6. You ask the next person, who's on the team? Well, it's us 7, including the finance person who comes and presents all the financial data and then stays on. No, they're not on the team. Yeah, they are on the team. Being on a team is a social construct. It's something we create among ourselves. We like to talk about being on a team because it encourages us to feel that belongingness. And it encourages us to commit to our colleagues. If I'm a team leader, I want everyone to feel part of a team because they're going to feel more committed. Organizations are not real as such. They're legal entities. I've got a contract with an organization, but to then think of an organization as a boundaried entity, a bit misleading. If you walk into a lot of organizations, there's some people there who've got a contract with that company, and then you'll find some contractors. You'll find some people who work with a joint venture partner. The meta-systemic lens says all of those ways of thinking that I've described so far are useful sometimes in certain contexts, but they're not real. These are just metaphors. And sometimes it can be very limiting to think only about the people who work in my team or my division or my organization. A lot of team coaching focuses on the relationships between the people in the team, which is useful to do. But we mustn't ignore the fact that everybody on the team interacts just as much with people outside the team. And what happens in those conversations is just as much a part influences what happens in the room as the pure relationships in the room. So the meta-systemic perspective says, just be careful about comparing the organization to a system. It isn't a system. That sometimes that metaphor doesn't serve us well. Yeah, COVID. Dr. Tedros, World Health Organization, said early on, we've got a choice. Can we come together to face a common dangerous enemy, or do we allow ourselves to be distracted and divided? And a lot of nations allowed themselves to be distracted and divided. They came up with their own strategies. They were absolutely fixated on getting their vaccines. They, as I said before, they tried to close the boundaries, but closing boundaries, you still got infections. In Sydney, we let a whole cruise liner full of infected people out. You know, there aren't these real boundaries. We're all connected. We all need to engage. If those people thinking through a meta-systemic lens in COVID would have been thinking about we, us, and the whole community. Okay, back to practical terms. Marie is still a bit perplexed, but she started to understand about how all this work is co-created by her and her colleagues. And if they were to spend a bit more time outside delivery, working out how to work together more collaboratively, life would be easier. So she is starting to explore other people's perspectives and starting to think more, I'm not going to say systemically, more complex systemically. Hero encourages Marie to keep on working the system, exploring beliefs, watching people interact. And through Marie's question, her line manager supports this new way of working. He starts to realize how his thinking has become shaped over the years by conversations he's had with senior management. He chooses to be more choiceful in how he responds. Now this conversation that started out as a one-to-one conversation about somebody's time management abilities has become something different because it needed to in this case. Marie's approach is working, it's going well. Hero thinks, but progress is slow. So Judy starts asking questions beyond the systemic metaphor. What people outside of the organization might be influencing about what's happening inside the organization. So Hero's frame of reference expands, and new questions occur to him. Like, for example, Murray's line manager. He hasn't just been influenced by the conversations he's had with his senior management. He's been influenced by conversations he's had in other firms that he's worked. He's influenced now by some of his colleagues in the networks that he's a part of. He's influenced by the barista when he gets his coffee in the morning. He's influenced by the conversations he has with his friends down the pub. So Hero and Marie and Judy's frame of reference becomes broader in a way that that any systemic metaphor can limit. Hero's new question. So if we take away the boundaries, who does Marie talk to, whether they're part of the team organization or not? Who's she spoken to in the past? Who do the people Marie talks to talk to? Who did they talk to? Whose influences are showing up most in Marie's current predicament? That's a complex systemic perspective on the left, where we put all these boundaries in place. This is more of a meta-systemic perspective, where we're looking at the social network. We're not worrying about these boundaries too much because they're artificial. So we think not just about people in Marie's team or a functional organization, we think about Marie's conversations with Sally, her best friend, and how they may be influencing things. And that conversation may be more influential than the conversations she has with Bob, who's a team member. So coming back to the Hawkins model, Peter Hawkins' philosophies these days, I think, are pretty complex, systemic, but this is a very much a complex systemic model. Notice all the boundaries. We're comparing it to a system. What this model, again, I think, is too confined by the boundaries. We need to talk more broadly and recognize that everything that happens in an organization, in a team, is impacted by everything that happens outside. And that's the meta-systemic perspective. So the magnifying glass is a metaphor for how you think. How you think determines what questions you ask. Your questions are never neutral. What I'm not suggesting here for one moment is that we all go and lecture our clients on system thinking. No, this is about educating ourselves in the first place, because the more ways of thinking we have access to, then the more different types of question we're going to ask. And the questions that we ask are important because how we think shows up in the questions that we ask, and the questions that we ask influence how others think. So have we got time, Claire, just for some breakout rooms for about 10 minutes? Yeah, so I'm going to ask you just to go out into breakout rooms just for 10 minutes and think about your beans. So having listened to this, just have a little bit of a think about, all right, which ones of those ways of thinking what resonated most for me in my role as coach supervisor? Distribute your 100 beans. Just spend just a few seconds thinking about that by yourselves, and then in your groups, just have a conversation just in your groups about how you distributed your beans. What insights have come up for you today? And what implications does this have for your ongoing development as a coach or coach supervisor or leader, if there are leaders in the room? So can we go?
Perfect.
Yeah, cool. I'd say groups of 3, if we can do sort of that, given that we've only got about 10 minutes, groups of 3s would be good. 2s and
Sure.
3s.
All set up, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. I might go.
Sorry for interrupting all your conversations, but I recognise we only have about 5 minutes. Just before I close down the slides, there's lots of free materials on the system stuff at both of these 2 addresses. Your Leading Systemically, and a number of books which look at change in general, including the systemic perspective. But let me just, although we've only got a few minutes, let me just open it up to any insights, thoughts, or even questions.
So Paul, there's one in the chat there. There was someone was asking, I would be interested to know more about why your approach is different to the 7-eyed model.
Because to me, they're fundamentally different. The 7-eye model encourages you to think about the organization in terms of boundaries and systems. So it's essentially what it does is it reminds us to look more broadly. Reminds us to look more broadly than just the issue that the coach is having with the client, which is where a lot of supervision conversations focus. It's saying, yeah, don't just look at that. Look also at your relationship with the person that you're coaching. Look also at things that are happening outside the system and their impact on that relationship. What the 7-eye model, and this is not a criticism of the 7-eye model, because that's a very useful function. What the 5 ways of thinking about systems says, okay, that's good. Have a look at more broadly about what's going on here, but how are you going to interpret what you're seeing? You can use the 7-eye model and think about that purely in linear systemic terms, and that will take you, that will lead to certain insights. You can use the 7-eye model and look at it through a complex systemic lens, and that will lead to different insights. So the 7-eye model performs a certain function, but what it doesn't do in itself, and Hawkins is quoted as saying one of the things coaches need to do is to educate themselves on systems thinking. It doesn't actually specifically invite us to consider how we're interpreting what we're saying.
Thank you. So we are coming up to time. If there's one quick question, 2 questions. The recording, yes, we will send it out to everyone who's attended and everyone who registered. Paul, there's a question about, can you share the slides?
Yeah, very happy to, yeah.
Okay, so we'll send that out with the thank you email. Denise is very happy about that. And this is Paul's book. Just take the blurry background off, apologies for that, which is absolutely fabulous and goes into even more detail. I got that easy off Amazon. It's got a really nice texture on the cover as well, Paul. Is there one more pressing quick question before we close? That was such a lot in an hour. Yeah. Really great. Everyone's thumbs up and nodding. Thank you, Paul. Really appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
And enjoy the rest of your day and your evening over there, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul.
Very much. Bye.
Thank you.